Howdy, partner, and welcome back to Big and Stuff. My name is Greg, and I sure do like me a nice little RPG from time to time. And one of the biggest JRPGs around has got to be... Okay, I'm done with the cowboy voice. I can't do that the whole video. One of the biggest names in the realm of JRPGs is undoubtedly Final Fantasy, with 15 mainline games to contend with and a 16th on the way, not to mention an absolutely ungodly number of spin-offs and miniseries based on those mainline games. Final Fantasy is one hell of an intimidating beast to try to get into, and as such I've had a lot of friends who would almost certainly enjoy these games be put off from giving it a shot because they just don't know where to start. With so many games, there's got to be a ludicrous amount of continuity and lore to keep track of, right? And having to start all the way back at the beginning with an NES game from the 80s just to understand what's going on in the current game sounds like such a pain. Do I really have to? Well, I have great news for you. The answer to both of these questions is no, not really. Each main numbered entry in this series is completely self-contained. They all take place in their own distinct universe that's completely separate from all the other games. They have their own storyline and setting and a cast of characters that's totally unique to that game without any real continuity between main entries to worry about. And because of this, you can really start wherever you want. It truly doesn't matter, just play whichever one sounds the most interesting to you. But I do believe there are a few starting points that will be more comfortable for you as a new player than others, depending on what kind of player you are. If you're the kind of person who, regardless of what I just said, still feels the need to take it from the top and experience everything the series has to offer, then the answer for you is pretty simple. Start with Final Fantasy I. Released in 1987 for the NES, the original Final Fantasy is a solid but comparatively simple JRPG experience. It lays the basic foundation that later entries would continue to build on and evolve, but not much more than that. If you played anything in this genre before, then most of what's going on here will be pretty familiar to you. The original creative team at Squaresoft set out to replicate the feeling of playing through a tabletop RPG like D&D, but as a video game that could be played solo. And as such, it's a mostly standard hero's journey setup, with a party of adventurers teaming up to travel the world, get stronger, and defeat an evil Dark Lord. It does do some unique things with that initial setup that I won't spoil, and a lot of the gameplay was incredibly impressive and influential at the time, but to be honest with you, it's pretty dated these days. It kind of feels like a chore to play at times if you're not super into old school, slow-paced, grindy role-playing. So I really would only recommend you start here if you're absolutely determined to play through the entire series, or if you've already gotten into the series with a later entry and wanted to go back to see how it all started. As far as play order from here, I'm just going to assume you want to play it all, so just follow the numbers in sequence. And be aware that some games, like 10 and 13, have direct sequels set in the same universe that you want to check out as well for the full experience. I'll link a full list of every game in the description so you hardcore people who want everything can dig into that. If, however, you don't feel the compulsion to jump into the deep end like that and you just want a taste of this era before moving on to newer games, I would start with Final Fantasy VI. It's basically the culmination of everything the dev team learned in the course of making the series up to that point, and presents the most comprehensive and polished take on all of the ideas presented in the old school run of games. It also has one of the best stories and cast of characters in the whole series, so if you don't mind playing an older game, but you don't want to commit to the whole hog, then I'd definitely start with 6. Also, if you live outside of Japan, make sure you check which versions you get, since we only got 1, 4, and 6 localized in the West initially, but they were called 1, 2, and 3 here so that we didn't know we were skipped over for some of the games. That can definitely cause some confusion, but luckily Square is doing a pixel remaster of all the old NES and Super Nintendo games with their proper titles restored, so it should be pretty easy to get your hands on the real Final Fantasy III, for example, rather than Final Fantasy VI with a 3 slapped onto it. If the first 6 games represent old school Final Fantasy, then I think, like many other series at the time, the next big step forward came when it made the leap from 2D pixel art to 3D polygons, with the advent of the PlayStation 1. And of this era, the choice is obvious. Even people who know nothing about RPGs know about Final Fantasy VII. The game is legendary and maybe the most popular game in the whole franchise, and that's for good reason. Final Fantasy VII is set in a futuristic dystopian world where a massive global corporation controls just about everything, including the government and the military. They use this influence to drain a mystical living substance called Mako from the planet's core. This Mako is the source of power for everything from killer robots to super soldiers to sorcery. What the Shinra Corporation doesn't know is that running out of Mako pretty much means the end of the world. And so you play as ex-soldier Cloud Strife as he helps out an old friend to rebel against the evil Shinra Corp and save the world by any means necessary, even if that means being branded an eco-terrorist in the process. This story is so full of insane surprises and heartbreaking twists, and the world it presents is so fascinating and deep that it's no wonder this game has gotten about 1 million spin-offs since its release back in 1997. I never thought it was possible for a game with no voice acting and characters that look like this to make me as emotional as this one did, but goddamn does it pull that off in spades. The characters in this one are easily my favorite in any RPG. Each party member is so fleshed out and well realized that by the end of it, they feel like a group of real friends that you've just gone on an insane journey with. Recommending Final Fantasy VII is a no-brainer. If you can get to the end of this one and not want to see more of the series, then you simply have no taste. I'm sorry, that's just how it is. But if you do fall in love with 7 like I did, then the rest of this era, from the somewhat controversial romantic stylings of 8 to the more classical fantasy callback of 9, are both going to be well worth checking out. Moving to the PlayStation 2 also came with another big shift in the series, and a significant amount of modernization. Up to this point, going back to any of those games, no matter how good, meant putting up with at least a little bit of jank, considering how old they all feel. But starting with this era, everything holds up really well to this day, and going back is going to feel the most comfortable to more modern sensibilities. The biggest factor contributing to this feeling, of course, is the inclusion of full voice acting for the first time in the series, beginning with my starting point recommendation for this era, Final Fantasy X. FF10 is the first time in the main series to feature voice acting, and the last to feature a fully turn-based battle system. So this is the best place to start if you want to experience that older RPG style of gameplay, but with graphics that hold up today, and a story that's much more approachable due to the voice acting. The presentation here is really top-notch, and the world of Spira is a lovely tropical paradise with so much variety in its landscapes and creatures that it feels like you're seeing new, crazy stuff the whole way through. It's got a fun fish-out-of-water kind of story, with an interesting cast and combat that's easy to get accustomed to. This isn't my absolute favorite in the series, but as a starting point, it's hard to think of a better introduction to how Final Fantasy works as a series, and if you like what you see here, you'll have an easy time going forward or backwards to pretty much any other entry without issue. And if you really like 10, then it does have a direct sequel called 10-2 that's set in the same world and stars a lot of the same characters, and serves as a kind of a continuation to the story of 10. It's not essential to play, as 10 does tell a complete story, but it's a cool bonus if you end up getting really invested in the world and want more out of it. As for the other games of this era, FF11 is an MMO, and I don't really play MMOs so I can't speak to its quality, but I've heard it was fun. The console version server shut down in 2016, but the PC version is still active to this day, so you can check it out if that piques your interest. The last game of this era was Final Fantasy XII. While I personally thought it was pretty sweet, I don't really recommend starting here. The story is dense and interesting, but the combat is weird. It uses a real-time system that relies on you commanding AI companions and programming them with certain behavior patterns that you want them to do in combat. It's a cool concept, but I believe it would be kind of overwhelming to a brand new player, and is definitely not representative of the series as a whole. The most recent era of the Final Fantasy series covers everything from 13 to 16, and I'll include the 7 remake too. 13 has a cool story, but it takes a long time to get going, and the cast can be a bit off-putting at first. Combining that with its extremely linear nature means that, well, it's not a bad game by any means. I wouldn't start here, as it might give you the wrong idea about Final Fantasy as a whole. It does have 2 sequels though, in 13-2 and Lightning Returns, so if you do get into it, there's plenty to chew on here. 14 is once again an MMO, so I can't personally vouch for it, but the general consensus seems to be that it's one of the best MMOs out there, so if that is your cup of tea, you'll be in good hands. 15 is actually the first Final Fantasy I ever played, and I liked it so much, I actually went back and played the rest of them, so I can safely say that it is a decent starting point. It's a sprawling and ambitious open-world adventure, with a likable cast of down-to-earth anime boys going on a fantasy road trip to save their kingdom. Speaking of kingdoms, the Kingdom Hearts-esque real-time combat is a lot of fun once you get the groove of it, and the story has a lot of really great moments. Most of the major criticisms leveled at 15 over the years have been sorted out through updates and DLC by now, so if you snag the Royal Edition, you'll be all set for a great time. But that's not my recommendation for this era. If I had to pick one game to start with from the modern Final Fantasies, it would have to be Final Fantasy VII Remake. Everything I said about the original applies here too. The story and characters are all faithfully translated and fleshed out to an extraordinary level of polish and care. The whole world is brought to life with all of today's fancy technology and a modern approach to game design and storytelling. so I can easily recommend the remake with just as much enthusiasm as I did for the original. It's like seeing your favorite novel get adapted into a big budget HBO series. And, while you might get even more out of it if you have played the original FF7 beforehand, it's definitely not a requirement. The story of the FF7 remake is being told across 3 games, and with the second chapter coming hopefully next winter, now is as good a time as any to hop onto the hype train with the rest of us. It's a fantastic and exquisitely crafted experience that I can confidently say will leave you with a great impression of the series, and easily compel you to look into everything else that the series has to offer. So to wrap everything up in a nice little bow, you can start this series just about anywhere you damn well please, but my picks for the best starting points in each generation would be Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, or Final Fantasy VII Remake. And from there, you can pretty much hop around to whatever catches your eye. I hope this video was helpful to anyone looking to hop into the series for the first time. Remember to smash that like button if it was. And if you're already a Final Fantasy fan, maybe you can drop the game that got you started in the comments, or speak to your experience with the MMOs if you've played them. And for more discussions on all things gaming and pop culture, subscribe to Big and Stuff. It's free, and it helps me out a ton. With all that being said, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end, and have a final fantastic day.